Welcome to the Grace Space, a transmission for the sovereign soul. That's not many different stories. That's one story that has been repeated endlessly in different variations, but one story about something that happened to us, something that happened to humanity, something that happened to the kingdom, the realm, right? Probably more than once. Maybe this story was hidden in myth because it could not survive as fact. And because it was hidden in myth, we were told it isn't really real. What if it is real? Hey everyone, real quick before we begin, if this content matters to you, you're warmly invited to subscribe to this channel, to like this video, to leave a comment, or all three. I read all the comments, and your engagement is really important because when you engage, it tells YouTube to push this content out to more people who would find value in it. Now that I understand this, I engage a lot more with the channels that are important to me because I know it really matters. Thanks for listening. Here we go. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Grace Space. Spiritual maturity has revived a fascinating tales for me. You know, we think of fairy tales as children's stories, but everybody knows that their content is often very dark and very coded. You know, if fairy tales were never only children's stories, then maybe they were never meant to entertain us so much as to remind us of something, to encode in a deeply symbolic way something archetypally true, and I would say even painful about the human story, about our past, maybe even the origins of this fallen world that we've been living in for so long. And I started thinking about where do fairy tales come from anyway? Their origins are lost in the mists of time. I mean, well, most likely because they were part of oral tradition and they were passed down from generation to generation before they were ever collected and, written down by the names that we know today, like Brothers Grimm, Charles Perrault, and others. Maybe they are ancient memory devices, kind of like symbolic maps that are handed down through image and story because some truths about us, about our history, are too large, too tender, or too dangerous to survive as direct history. These tales have a hold over us because they include so much of the mystical and the magical. Like they occupy this liminal space in our psyche between fantasy and reality, kind of like how you perceive the world as a child. When we're in that alpha, theta brainwave state as children, that makes reality much more fluid. And in fairy tales, you're living in that world, aren't you? You've got talking animals and fabled creatures like goblins and trolls and beasts and monsters, enchanted toys. I mean, basically things that we as adults and in our day and age don't consider to be real. And certain versions of fairy tales also contain graphic violence and sexual references. Not necessarily material for children, is it, when you start thinking about it? And as the veil of our reality thins and more information comes to light about how this world has been run, what systems it has been part of, And the underlying dark funding mechanisms of the artificial construct, which is the matrix, and all of that stuff is revealed, you got to wonder about the old fairy tales. How much is fantasy and how much may actually be, again, encoding or revealing dark truths about what humanity has endured in the past and largely forgotten? Why the persistence of certain recurring themes, recurring themes and creatures and events in fairy tales all across the world? If one fairy tale contained a curse, that would be interesting. If one fairy tale contained an evil stepmother or evil parent, that would be interesting. If one fairy tale contained a sleeping princess, that would be interesting. But so many fairy tales across countries and languages and cultures and centuries. Why do they keep telling the same story? Why do we keep telling the same story? In that sense, fairy tales may not merely tell us what happened once upon a time. Maybe they're telling of currents that are woven into the human story across eons of time. They're talking about what persists, what is still echoing through our DNA, what is now calling for attention so that we can heal it. Why do we retell these stories over and over again? And why have they been so strongly co-opted, we could say, by like Disney and Pixar and, right? I'm just asking the question. Many years ago, I was in a private session with my beloved teacher, Satyavrati. He had me pull some cards from this well-worn oracle deck that he sometimes used to prompt reflection or a direction in the field. And the first card I picked showed a princess asleep inside a glass casket in a dark wood, right? The archetypal image of Sleeping Beauty. And I still remember that reading because it spoke so eloquently of my state in that moment and of what I had put to sleep within myself, right? In the dark, the true beauty of the authentic self was still sleeping in a dark wood. And there were two other cards, which I won't get into, but they were equally telling. And that reading and those three archetypal cards stayed with me for years now. I still think about what they were telling me. I still go back sometimes and I took pictures of them. I still go back and look at the pictures and look at the symbolism and the images and everything because they continue to reveal themselves to me now, at this different stage of evolution that I'm in about, what was going on back then and how much things had changed. Anyway, the Sleeping Beauty card got me interested in that fairy tale again and what it meant, not only for me, but like for humanity. What truth is that tale trying to tell us? What is it trying to communicate? What darkness from our past was it pointing to that could be brought into the light and healed? Sleeping Beauty is so much more than just a story about a princess in a towered kingdom, like so many towers and castles that I saw in France when I was living in that region. We were just, there were ruins and castles everywhere. I mean, I can still see the illustrations, and I even remember the smell of the pages of my child's version of the story, the book that I had of Sleeping Beauty. And I still remember the feeling of horror and dread in my body that was invoked by the illustration of her pricking her finger on the spindle of the spinning wheel. and the dark blood and the dark queen with the horns. I mean, and the spinning wheel haunted me. And I see it now as the representation of the wheel of karma in the sense that, of forgetting and being stuck in the reincarnational loop and getting lost in the construct of the inversion. For years, I the imprinting on my mind of the danger of the spinning wheel made it so that I couldn't even like take in the mundane function of the spinning wheel, like what it was actually used for. To me, it was always an occult instrument of danger. In that sense, Sleeping Beauty is a portrait of humanity itself, something radiant, beautiful, intact, and alive, yet placed under a spell so complete that it forgets its own nature. It just goes to sleep. Sleeping Beauty is us. The castle is the inner kingdom, and the sleep is not rest at all, but a kind of adaptation, I guess you could say, like a suspended state that we entered in order to survive contact with something false. And what we call awakening is not the acquisition of new wisdom, but the end of a long enchantment, not only for humanity, but for our planet too. It's about the reawakening of the feminine consciousness. The feminine consciousness is the heart consciousness. The heart consciousness has long been suppressed here. And I know it can be problematic for women, like that motif in fairy tales of the princess being rescued by the prince, being awakened by the prince. I get that. And I remember my own programming around it and the learned helplessness and the unconscious feeling of dependence on men that I grew up with. I'm not saying that that layer isn't there in fairy tales, but we can get stuck on it if we haven't looked deeply into the true balance of masculine and feminine energies when they are each fully themselves, when we haven't understood how they go out of balance, when we haven't understood that the princess or the feminine represents the heart and the prince or the masculine represents the mind. For thousands of years, the mind has been unmoored, disconnected from the heart consciousness. And when that happens, it becomes monstrous, right? And therefore it has dominated and abused and terrorized the heart, right? This is part of the parasitical inversion, and we're now entering a new era where the mind is remembering it's supposed to be connected to the heart and the heart intelligence. And the heart is learning to step forward again to be honored by the mind. So the sleeping princess is not helplessness. It's it's dormant essence. And the prince and the princess coming together is the moment of awakening, the union of masculine and feminine energies in harmony again. Now we'll come back to that, but I want to look at how these and other elements that recur in fairy tales act like puzzle pieces that, when reassembled, tell us something about what may have happened to us long, long ago, long forgotten chapters of our human story that went underground. Many fairy tales, as you know, talk about curses and spells and enchantments. Right? A curse or a malediction has been laid upon the land, a spell is cast over a person, an enchantment lies over a whole kingdom. These are states of entrancement. We could also call it mind control, okay, where we don't have access to our full power, or that access has been distorted or it has been intercepted in some way. In other words, our natural capacity as creator beings has been twisted or interfered with so that our best efforts often end in ashes. Our progress is opposed, or we're just asleep. we're amnesic. We have forgotten who we are, right? The spell is forgetfulness. It's the loss of direct knowing, the condition in which we no longer perceive reality clearly. We can't decode the truth anymore. It's like we've been reconnected to some other reality and we're only allowed to decode that reality. There have always been people who operated outside of that, thank goodness. But, this is the spell, the enchantment, the trance, right? The malediction that we've all been under. And part of the spell is normalization, right? The moment when that unnatural state becomes normal, becomes just what you know and what you accept without questioning. And the most powerful spell is not the one that imprisons you, it's the one that convinces you there is no prison, right? So that is a persisting theme, motif in fairy tales, so much so that I think we've got to explore that for the truth that it may be pointing to. In many fairy tales, there's an evil parent or a step parent, right? Someone who is not your real parent, right? Someone in a position of authority who's meant to take care of you, but they neglect you or they even work against you. There's jealousy, there's spite, there's superiority. Why do fairy tales so often contain a parent who does not protect? Because perhaps humanity carries a memory of being governed by systems that never truly served life. Paternalistic systems that were actually not there to serve us, right? Not just governments, institutions, belief systems, authorities, structures that claimed stewardship, but were actually feeding on what they governed. I might as well say that in the present tense because it still occurs, right? So the authority figure entrusted with care who instead exploits. We see it everywhere, not just in the fairy tales. So that's the inversion of guardianship, the betrayal of trust, not just happening to us, but to the planet. And this is nothing new or recent. This exploitation has been in place. It has been standard practice for thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. There's also the beast. And I think this is important. The beast is rarely evil. The beast is misunderstood, right? Usually enchanted somehow. To me, the beast represents distorted life, distorted life force, unlived life, right? The twisted or the monstrous creature that emerges when our natural energies are suppressed and our DNA is interfered with. Let's not forget that. Life trapped beneath the spell, which is very different. And how about the forest, right? The forest appears constantly. Red Riding Hood, Hansel and Gretel, Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, right? The forest is the unconscious, the place beyond the village, beyond civilization, the place where forgotten things live, the place where truth is waiting. It's the place that civilization teaches us to fear. What's that quote? The cave that you fear to enter contains the answers that you seek, right? This the same could be said about the dark forest, the dark wood. In the forest, fairy tale characters often encounter talking animals, for example. Modern people assume that talking animals are fantasy, but animals talk all the time. They just don't necessarily use words. And there are people who communicate with animals in very deep, intimate, meaningful ways. It's just a different form of communication. So to me, these talking animals represent kind of like a remembered intimacy with nature. When a time where we could experience ourselves as participants in the living world, in relationship with it on a creational level, not the masters of it, not dominating it, not separate from it, part of it. Then there's this element of uh, children. What happens to children in fairy tales? They often contain shocking violence towards children, abandonment, predation, consumption, threat. Well, obviously, children symbolize innocence and originality, the untouched, the pure, and something in the collective remembers that innocence was targeted, is targeted, not merely physically, but psychologically and spiritually. One of the great tenets of the inversion is called, there's a name for it, the corruption of innocence or the destruction of innocence. We see it all over Hollywood. We see it happening, through social engineering. We see it in the music business. I mean, this is nothing new once again. It's in the fairy tales. And finally, there's this theme of royalty. Why is everybody secretly a prince or a princess? Why, why not accountants or bakers? Well, there are bakers. Well, why royalty? Why so much royalty? Well, because royalty symbolizes sovereignty. It's sovereignty, right? It's the lost inheritance, the forgotten birthright. Story is always, you have forgotten who you are. Your identity has been concealed. You are the heir to the kingdom that you have forgotten all about. And the kingdom of heaven is within, right? I remember years ago, I still remember this dream. I had this dream that somebody came to me and said, "You've inherited $38 billion." dollars. I don't know why that number, $38 billion. dollars. And I was like, really? They were like, yeah. They said it was yours all along. I'm like, oh, wow. Well, I mean, more than I could ever, that's more than I could ever spend. And they were like, yeah, well, it's yours. And they showed me the check. It was made out to me and it said $38 billion dollars on it, right? That's like the lost inheritance, right? It's like you've always been abundant. You've always, we were always going to inherit the kingdom, right? So what happens if we place all of these various fragments together? Kingdoms, spells, the usurper, the sleeping heir, the forgotten inheritance, the wounded land, the beast under enchantment, the journey through the dark forest. It's all a return of remembrance, and that is also happening in the fairy tales, right? Like everybody wakes up again, everybody, the spell is broken, right? That's not many different stories. That's one story that has been repeated endlessly in different variations, but one story about something that happened to us, something that happened to humanity, something that happened to the kingdom, the realm, right? Probably more than once. Maybe this story was hidden in myth because it could not survive as fact. And because it was hidden in myth, we were told it isn't really real. What if it is real? A few weeks ago, during a meditation, uh, I had an experience that deepened this intuition. I felt like I went inside myself and I kind of went on a journey into the earth, not like a backdrop or scenery, but as her living presence, connecting with her living presence, as a being. And what I perceived was, and it wasn't just my perception because I felt it. That's how I knew that there had been a violation long ago Well, you can say, duh, obviously everybody, we know that. Well, it's one thing to know about it, but it's quite another to feel it in your body, to remember it, to know with your knowingness, with your body, that something invaded the earth, something dark. It felt like, and this was an image that I saw, a black seed landing in her womb and spreading out and invading. I felt the violation. And violation is different from evil. Evil can become abstract. Violation is so intimate. It suggests that something whole has been trespassed upon, something living has been invaded, disrupted, poisoned. And that word, violation, just, it landed in me with force. I felt it in my own body with a kind of just knowingness. And there was a lot of grief that came with it. Again, grief that I could feel in my own body. And I felt this amazing resonance with the planet. Like, wow, I'm actually feeling just a one tiny, teeny iota of what she's feeling. But I knew it was enough to show me that there was a resonance between us. And the realization of that violation of what had happened, knowing that something had happened, suggested to me that the deepest work for us may be this slow, courageous willingness to admit that something happened. Not just to know about it, but to actually to let yourself feel it. Because that violation, that invasion that our mother suffered has affected every single one of us because we are all quantumly entangled with her. That's what I experienced. That my body was her body, that my heart was her heart. We share in that trauma. Now, I've spoken with and had the privilege of listening to many survivors now, and you've heard some of their stories here in the grace space. And what I've learned from them is that at some point, they got their memories back, the memories of the trauma and the torture that they were subjected to in government or military programs or inside their own families or off planet. I mean, and it wasn't supposed to happen that way. They were not supposed to remember, but they did. Something in every case, something was activated in them, and they started to remember. And as they started to remember, they were able to make sense of things that they had never understood in their lives. And as they started to remember and make sense of things and acknowledge the horror that they had been through, they started to heal. And, remembrance is not merely a mental recall, it is a full body experience. It is somatic, it is moral, it is spiritual. It is the reorganization or healing that begins when the truth is no longer exiled from consciousness. And that's how it happens, right? I mean, that is the nature of trauma exiles the horrible truth from consciousness. And that's where I feel like these fairy tales have been like a bookmark for us, holding the story of what happened on this planet that we all share in and that is passed down literally through our DNA, just as these tales were passed down orally from generation to generation until we could remember and face the trauma of it. And this is where it becomes personal for all of us. When severe trauma occurs, something in us has to split in order to endure it. And that is an intelligent mechanism of survival. And because the split was adaptive, we collectively and individually built an identity around surviving it. And therefore, the same is true collectively. At a civilizational level, at a familial level, even at the level of consciousness itself, healing begins with the simple but world altering admission, yes, something happened. Not so that we can make an identity out of victimhood, not so that we can romanticize damage or live forever inside the wound, but because life cannot reorganize around truth until truth is admitted. Simple enough. Hence, the phase of disclosure we are in, and this is where I want to connect all of this to disclosure, and why I've keep saying over and over that disclosure is not about aliens, it is not about exotic technology, it is not about the Epstein files. Yes, all of those are parts of disclosure, right? But they are just pieces in a much larger puzzle that is about us and who we are and who this planet is and the magnitude of what has been hidden from us and how we humans have been used, abused, extracted, manipulated, fed upon, and suppressed to the point where we walk around in an artificial construct in a hypnotic trance, asleep, having completely forgotten who we are, asleep to realities whose details are frankly so traumatizing that the truth can only be shared with the masses on a drip feed so that the mind of the average person can start to get a handle on the fact that nothing, and I mean nothing, is what it seemed without totally dissociating or going into denial. But make no mistake, those in charge of quote unquote official disclosure are not doing that to protect you and preserve you. And I mean, the general public out of the goodness of their hearts. They are scared shitless of what will realize the mind-bending magnitude of the deception that has been perpetrated on us and for how long and by whom. Oh boy. Oh boy, what a time we are living in. We are going to have to face the trauma of what happened to us and to the planet so long ago, without which remembrance we cannot understand the events of today. What is unnamed remains ambient. What we don't grieve remains active. What we deny repeats itself in costume after costume, system after system, relationship after relationship. We all have the experience of that. And this is why the fairy tales matter so much. They don't end with the spell, they don't conclude with permanent enchantment, permanent winter, permanent barrenness. The spell is never the last word. Sleeping Beauty awakens. The enchanted castle stirs. Time resumes, or maybe we could say like the normal flow of time resumes. Life returns. Our story does not end with violation, it ends with regeneration. Something happened, yes, and we need to realize that. We need to face it, we need to see it, we need to acknowledge it. That is why we are living in the time of apocalypse, of revelation. That's what we all came here for. Because now we are remembering, we are part of this moment in the fairy tale where the land is renewed, right? The kingdom was stolen, yes, but now the kingdom is awakening. The feminine was violated, yes, but now the feminine is rising, not as power over, as life resuming, because it's time. Sleeping Beauty is not awakened by the prince. That is the outer story. The deeper story, and this is what I wanted to come back to, is that the spell reaches its expiration. There's a time limit on these things. Something within the kingdom becomes stronger than the enchantment. That is what is happening with us. We are rising again. The prince merely arrives at the moment that the remembrance becomes possible, and the union of masculine and feminine can be made whole again. That's the moment we're in. Humanity is not being rescued. Humanity is remembering. The spell is weakening because the life beneath it never died, and the expiration date of the parasitic invasion is nigh. And maybe what the fairy tales were telling us all along was that moment would eventually come, that it was inevitable. So if you are in a season of questioning, of disorientation, of doubt, of feeling too much, of sensing all of the old maps are failing, you can't rely on any of them anymore, that may be your clearest evidence that the spell over you is weakening. And and if you don't think you've been under a spell, think again. We all have been. We have all been under some degree of mind control, asleep to the adaptations that we've made to make it all okay. We have been living in someone else's world. We have been living in someone else's world, in a kingdom under enchantment. We are all Sleeping Beauty, but now we are awakening. So this is where I want to leave you with a question, not a conclusion. Where in your life have you taken the adaptation for your identity? Where have you accepted a substitute for what is sacred and alive and real? Where have you believed in the false construct as the only reality? And what might begin to change if you allowed yourself to feel, to contact your own grief that reveals where love was violated? Not to stay there, not to live there forever, but to acknowledge it so that that love, the true light of your being, can begin to shine through the new opening in your heart. I'll see you again soon. Meanwhile, walk in grace. You've been listening to The Grace Space. To amplify this field, you're welcome to like, subscribe, or share. Thank you.